Welcome to RevOps Revolution, where we focus on changing the game for driving revenue. I'm your host, Jesse Morris, and each episode we take a look at the different areas that affect change and drive revenue across your organization. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episode. Here's to the revolution. Welcome to another day of the revolution. I'm your host, Jesse Morris, and today we are lucky to have one of my friends and colleagues, Carrie, on the line. Welcome to the podcast, Carrie.
Thank you so much, Jesse.
So excited to have you here. Carrie and I have worked together at a prior company. She's held like a myriad of roles, everything from leading a large account management org, as well as being an individual rep. And so she's got good perspective on both ends of it. She's worked at both large and small companies, which I think is super valuable. And she and I have been friends for a while. Phenomenal leader. I think one of the things that I always look at when leaders is it's easy to lead through difficult times. It's hard to lead through challenging times. And Carrie and I have had to do that. And so it's fun to see, how she's been able to find the balance between driving outcomes, providing that accountability, and creating environments that people actually like showing up to work in. So Carrie, thanks so much. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. And like you mentioned, I've had roles that span the gamut of a global firm that had, hundreds of thousands of employees, all the way to a small startup where I had the opportunity to help kind of build things from the ground up. And, my entry point into the SaaS world really was as an individual contributor on the account management side. And I think, at the time I was working for a software company where I had a lot of domain expertise, and that really helped as I was establishing credibility and building my book of business. But it was really there that I started to crystallize my understanding of the importance of the intersection of people, process, and technology as it relates to driving the outcomes that you want. And I had a boss at the time who would joke about, you could go buy the fanciest lawnmower on the lot, but your lawn's not going to look any better if you don't have someone that has the aptitude and the appetite to actually mow the lawn. So that would not be me. But the point is that even with software, you can go buy the best software solution on the market, but if you don't have the right people in the right seats and you don't have the right processes to help them drive toward the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, then technology alone is not the answer.
I love that. I've never heard the lawnmower analogy. I like that one. That's kind of fun. It's funny because I do think a lot of times, especially in RevOps, but really in organizations, we see it all the time, right? Where it's like, we're going to buy this thing or we're going to put this initiative in place, but we don't put the people process component behind it and just how it falls. I think you and I have had to experience that actually as well. So totally get it. Makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things, as I was thinking about today in our conversation, one of the things that energized me was like, I always put myself in that shoes of like, what would somebody want to know? Like, what are some of the things? And I think one of the things that I'm sure a lot of people are wondering is how do you successfully run an AM org, what with focusing on both improving renewals and retention? Obviously those are kind of obviously related skill sets, but a little bit different. What do you feel like some of the tactics, strategies, methods you've done and you found success to actually achieve that?
Yeah, I think for me, data is so critical, and that's where the strong partnership with your revenue operations team can be so important. Um, you know, Being able to visualize the information that is important to your organization and that's consistent with the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. It sounds so obvious, but I think you and I have both probably worked in orgs where the data is spread across so many disparate systems that are owned potentially by different functions of the organization, and trying to wrangle all of that together to actually have a more comprehensive understanding of what's important to your team, which for an account management team, it's a lot that goes into that. You really are, the quarterback, right, of that customer's engagement with your organization. And so being able to just get your hands on all of the right data is so important. And so, speaking from personal experience working with you and your team in the past, really reinforced for me how critically important that partnership can be, as it relates to the retention of your customer base and looking for ways that you can identify expansion potential and look for those upsells. So if I go back to the kind of people, process, technology framework, specifically, you and I kind of partnered on an initiative to really dig in to how accounts are segmented across a team. And particularly if you are working for an org that has a large customer base with a lot of different customer profiles, from little tiny small accounts all the way up to big enterprise, Fortune 100 accounts. It's really important to assess the landscape of how those are stratified across your team through the lens of, is there expansion potential here, and what are they using of our available solutions versus what might still be on the table for them. And having that clear understanding of what your success metrics are, that really is the foundation, right? There was long time ago, I worked for an org where we had to read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, and beginning with the end in mind was one of his 7 habits. So I think when you're thinking about data, as you said, and kind of understanding what is important to people, I think beginning with the desired outcomes is the obvious first step. What are we solving for? What is it that we're trying to achieve, so that you can pull together the right data to help you understand where you might need to make some changes. It sounds so simple, but even just for a quota carrying team, having easy dynamic visibility into how your team members are performing against their quota shouldn't be hard, but it's surprising. I've been in organizations where that's had to be something to really look to pull together. And when you have that kind of visibility and you can understand, the makeup of your account base and how they're stratified across your team and when they're up for renewal and how many accounts is an appropriate number, all of that is informed by the data, and being able to get your hands on that data and visualize it in a way that not only supports your ability to make good business decisions, but also to share with your team members so that they have an understanding of how they're performing against their peers and against their own individual targets. I think that's really critical. So beyond the people element, there's the process element, right? So when you can actually look at what your results are, it can often surface where there's potential to kind of reimagine how your processes are enacted. Like, for example, there might be an opportunity if your team members are struggling with getting their renewals done on time, for example, and the data is showing that you've got some people that are not having a hard time getting their renewals done on time, but you have other people who are, and you can dig in and see this person who's getting them done on time, they've taken some initiative to automate some parts of their process. And when you can dig in and actually see that it is possible and it's just a difference in approach, that data can really help inform where maybe broader adoption of processes that'll automate some things can really help you drive toward the outcomes that you're looking for. And from the technology perspective, obviously everything we're talking about kind of depends on having the right systems that can support that type of visibility. But if it is something like automating notifications to customers, if there's something that needs to be communicated, and one approach would be to have everybody manually type out a personalized letter versus, hey, let's find solutions that can automate that. Using the data to help you formulate a strategy that really looks to each of those elements, the people, the process, and the technology. The data is the key for me.
So it's interesting, you talked about segmentation, and then you also talked a little bit about, like, communication and tools and potentially automating that. And I think about a lot of times, one of the projects when we were working on that segmentation example you gave me, was really like, how do we handle renewals, right? And how do we, because at the end of the day, when you're dealing with a large set of customers, it's not that you don't want to provide good service. In fact, I actually think it's all around how do you do it. And so it is that like recognition that how do we at least maybe make some of the, I don't want to say less important, but basic fundamental, data input, your renewal date is on XYZ date for XYZ amount. Please reach out if you've got questions. Like that's a very generic thing. And, while you could say, well, it'd be nice if it was personal, that frees up teams then to actually have those personal conversations with the clients that want it versus this, like, I'm going to try to customize everything to them. So it's a really good point of like bringing your kind of segmentation mentality at the beginning and with the systems, bringing those two things together to really create a really phenomenal process for the client.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think many people that are attracted to customer facing roles have a bit of a service mentality. And it's in our nature to want to say yes and be helpful and bend over backwards. And what can be a little bit of a paradigm shift is that not all customers are created equally. I think we understand that just, at the most basic level of the complexity of the business and what their goals and objectives are and how they're using the solutions. But also, just from a dollars and cents perspective, spending the same amount of time with a very small customer as you would with a very large enterprise customer just doesn't make sense from an ROI perspective. And so figuring out how, to your point with the segmentation, to get the accounts aligned with the right team members, right? So if I've got accounts where the data shows me that there is clear expansion potential, certainly I want that account to be in the hands of someone who has proven their selling success and they have the subject matter expertise to drive a more enterprise grade expansion versus an account who has maybe been with you for 10 years. They've never expanded. They will not, based on perhaps their industry or the nature of their business. And so it just doesn't make sense to say, I'm going to engage with them in the same way. So I think getting your team kind of bought into that concept is important. But I think people get it once you're able to, show that I'm able to take care of so many more customers by taking a little bit more of a macro approach.
And I think it's a good call out. It's something we talk about a lot. You talk about data here. And I think when people think of data, a lot of times they think mostly of quantitative, like, renewal dates and dollars in and all of these which are things obviously I love. But I think something that I'm often mindful of too, and this is an exercise we do a lot of, is it's easy to segment and say, okay, they haven't expanded in 10 years, so we're going to move them to this bucket and we're going to move on with our lives. But I think something you and I both have experienced in our careers is the importance of qualitative data and how that plays into that segmentation. So what that looks like is then going back to, our account managers or renewal specialists and saying, hey, here's what the data is telling us. What are we missing? And I think
Right.
that can also help kind of either confirm what we're seeing in the data or say, hey, you know what? They haven't, but I'm actually aware of they've had some recent org changes. They've acquired a couple new companies. They're
Yeah.
actually starting to, there's some chatter there. There's some other maybe data points we might want to look at bringing in here that could identify those as opportunities. So it's something that I don't know why I just thought of that now. Like I think it's a tension we always have to hold of, hey, we definitely want to be quantitative in nature and base our decisions in that. But at times, sometimes it's better actually to pump the brakes just a little bit, maybe not too much, and get that qualitative feedback from the account management org itself.
Yeah, I'm sure the account managers that are listening will love to hear that because sometimes we know the data doesn't always paint a complete picture, but I think directionally it points us to the right questions to ask and to validate.
Most definitely. So, talking about teams and shifting gears a little bit, I said this at the beginning in your intro. I've seen your ability to lead, and I know you don't want to take credit for all of it, but you are a great leader. And I think, one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, is your ability to lead through those challenging times and also driving outcomes, which is it's a very fine balance to do between of a. What do you feel like you did to help foster a culture that people still wanted to be there, to where you maintained your best reps even in tough times, where they wanted to bring their best selves every single day?
That's really nice, Jesse. Thank you. You know, I think the quality of our relationships, it's really the core of life, whether we're talking about our personal relationships, our family relationships, and certainly our professional relationships. And so I think first and foremost, I've always just aimed to be a very authentic leader who, as you say, is balancing the needs of the organization and, driving toward the outcomes that my team and I are accountable to, but also showing up as an empathetic and trustworthy human being. And I think, earning that trust takes time, but, not to sound like a Stephen Covey evangelist, but one of his other 7 habits is seek first to understand and then to be understood. And I'm sure many people have worked with leaders who have a little bit of that swagger, like, I know what needs to happen here, and I'm going to come in swinging out of the gate with my big changes. And, you know, not having taken that time to really understand first, maybe there's a good reason that things are being done the way that they are, and doing some wholesale change could potentially backfire. And so I've always thought to be really intentional about spending quality time with my teams to really understand what they feel like their barriers to success are. And, I've been surprised many times by what I can learn simply by creating a forum for people to come and share their feedback, where I'm very actively soliciting their feedback and inviting them to share what their struggles are. I think beyond that, just basic human desire to feel seen and heard and understood, it also allows your team members to feel like they can be part of the solution. And I think people very much support what they help create. And, if you can even come away from those types of sessions and follow back up and say, I heard you, and just a couple of these things are already underway. Obviously, you're not going to be able to solve every single problem, but to just demonstrate that you are listening and functioning as their advocate, I think goes a long way in building that trust. And then when the time comes where you're asking your team to do something that maybe they're less enthusiastic about, which we know happens, um, hopefully they see you as a leader who didn't make that decision in a vacuum, and that you are considering the broader landscape in that decision making process. And I this sounds probably cheesy, but I think the last thing I would say is you've got to have fun. You really have to find, especially when the times are tough, you have to be intentional about finding ways to bring the team together and, reinforce that we're all in this together, and we're all human beings that are, we have each other's backs, and find ways to laugh and celebrate people's successes, and catch people doing something right. I think those things, really help people feel like they're a part of a team that they want to be on, and they're not just kind of a, name on the screen. That's really important to me. We spend so much time at work, and working with people that you genuinely like and trust and respect makes all the difference.
I think it's a great point, and I love the fun call out. It's something that it's tough. It's tough in those times, even as a leader, when you're not feeling it. It's like, but you need to lead through that, and sometimes lean into the fact you're not feeling it. Yeah, it makes a huge difference, and it takes more time and energy on the front end, but obviously, like you know, to your point, we're all human beings, and some days a good laugh or I have the image in my head right now of like jumping on one foot with my hand raised in the air, dancing around outside. I don't know why. I think it's from a movie, but like that image is like always ingrained of this, like, kind of don't take yourself too seriously and help other people around you not as well. Cause yeah, especially in those hard times.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, the last thought that occurs to me there is just creating a culture where it's okay to make a mistake, but own it. And I think as a leader, so often it's scary to admit that you've made a mistake, but I think it's so important to be transparent in those times. And especially, like we were talking about before, when perhaps you did see in the data that this looked like the right approach, but going back to the qualitative feedback and, iterating on your initial findings and maybe potentially seeing that you need to pivot, that's part of business. That's part of life. And just being willing to own that, I think also just reinforces that culture of trust and that it's bi directional. Like, I'm going to own it if I make a mistake, but I also expect the same from you. And if you're kind of trying to, point the finger all over the place and not taking an opportunity to do the self reflection, then that's probably a conversation that, I would have with you as your leader is like, hey, let's look at maybe how we had some agency in this too.
Nope, I love it. It's like the one of my core values of leadership has always been own what you can own, which
Yeah.
it means that in no matter what circumstance, it might have not been the majority of your fault, but was there something you could have done, to improve it or make it better or maybe even avoided it? And I think that's something that's I've kind of I remember I had a process back in the day with marketing. Not that ever there's ever challenges on that end, but it is funny like looking back on that moment of it was easy to be like, well, it's not my, it's not my fault. It's not our fault, as RevOps, but it was impactful and it was powerful of saying, okay, look, I know none of us want to take ownership for this, but what, going next time so we can learn from things, what can we do about this going forward? So it's a great call out. So, obviously I love operations and you actually have a big knack for it. If you were building a new AM org today, what would be some of the foundational components that would make up that org from an operational perspective?
Yeah, I think we've touched on some of it, but again, beginning with the end in mind, right? Being really clear about the goals. What are the outcomes that we're driving toward so that you can start to pull together the data that will help really clarify your understanding of where you might need to consider, a new strategy, right? And having that visibility and being able to share it across your whole team, I think is just out of the gate so important. What are we solving for? How are we doing, both as an individual and as a team, can really highlight those areas where you do need to maybe consider some changes. Um, from the customer segmentation perspective, let's take a look. What are all of the accounts that we currently have, and how are they stratified across the team? And when are they up for renewal? And what is the current health of that customer? Are they at risk? Um, these foundational elements can really help start to formulate some of the more process oriented things that you need to establish, right? Like if I say, as a general rule of thumb, I want to be engaging with customers that are up for renewal, X months ahead. But in this case, I see that these accounts, are really in trouble and they're renewing sooner. Like you need that visibility of the broader landscape to help formulate your best practice approach, but then also to kind of really crystallize where you need to focus right now, because that's the nature of the business we're in, right? Is there's always the kind of sunny day scenario, and then there's always going to be the things that you aren't expecting and that you need to react to quickly. But I think the overarching goal is to build the foundation that supports your ability to adopt as much of a proactive posture as you possibly can. And so, having that visibility so that you can make those decisions on potentially distributing how accounts are segmented, I think would be, a pretty early endeavor. Another one is just documentation. I've worked at many orgs where you ask someone where to find something, and it's like, oh, I think I have that in an email from 3 years ago, or it's out on this intranet, but like a lot of it's out of date. Don't worry about that, but this part's right. Or, go ask this person. They know. And you're spending so much time just trying to understand, you know, the basics. Which template do I use if I'm going to do a business review? What's the playbook on how I engage in a difficult conversation? Whatever the expectations of your team are, they should be clearly documented with any templates, any playbooks, or any process documentation as far as like what that looks like in Salesforce, for example. That should really all live in one centralized source of truth. And that is a little bit of a passion project of mine, only because I am a firm believer in like teach someone to fish instead of continually hand them the fish. And the more that you can, get everybody aligned around what the source of truth is, which, means that you as the leader need to ensure that it's maintained and that you have the right stakeholders reviewing it regularly so that it stays current and accurate. But to me, that makes a huge difference in eliminating any ambiguity about what's expected or how to go about it.
It's a good call out. I think one of the big things that you often find is, to your point, it's like uniformity and consistency in process, right? Well, I use this field, and I think you dealt with some of that, early days, but that's a big thing is like how do we, and the part of that's on our end on RevOps to say, okay, how do we make this easy, like not 17 clicks deep, and not buried in some field that only shows up on screens on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. That's a big part of it. And then to your point, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is the reinforcement. And that's something that oftentimes I think gets missed is it's like, just do it. And then, 6 months later, you get to the point and you're like, where was this thing? And it's like, we haven't been doing this for the last 6 months. So it's a good call out. It's a really a balance between those things. And I think oftentimes, on the account management side, especially, you're in that struggle. You talked about it a little bit of like, what's this quarter look like? But also, like, if you're not looking ahead a quarter, the number of times you get blindsided by an upset customer because they never heard from us or they never heard back from support. Not that that ever happens, but any of those different scenarios, it again, the more organized you can be, it's not just for like you as a leader or a new account manager comes in, but it's actually for the existing account manager to be able to manage their whole patch and deal with lots of customers instead of trying to struggle through with only a few customers effectively at a time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes in certain market segmentations, I'm thinking of kind of a mass market approach where I really do think of it almost as a manufacturing process where it's like the volume is so large and like we discussed, the contract value isn't high. It doesn't warrant the same level of strategic engagement that, a more complex enterprise customer might require. And so you can adopt more of a linear approach and say, I'm going to go down the list. These are my accounts that are, in this stage and this is what I'm going to do. But for those of us that are working with a pipeline that has a lot more complexity to it, I think that's where the data is so key. I'm thinking about another project that you and I had partnered on together as it relates to data that I think um, can really be a game changer when you think about like where do I focus, right? Like I've got all these accounts, all of them are important, right? All of them probably could benefit from my engagement right now, but how do I prioritize and understand like where I should really be spending my time? And so beyond the obvious, I've got a big upsell opportunity or their contract is coming due and I need to be in touch. I think that's where that kind of distinction between the quantitative and qualitative data elements can be so insightful because I've worked in organizations where the entire notion of whether a customer is at risk is based on the account manager sentiment, right? Purely qualitative and arguably subjective, because based on who at that organization. They say they're happy, but that's maybe not the decision maker. And so I think that's where the partnership with RevOps to really dig in and understand what are the other quantitative indicators of potential churn, and what other elements can we be looking at to inform a more comprehensive understanding of the customer health. And you know that data can live in so many different systems, right? Which system sent out the NPS survey? That's probably a different system than where I'm going to go to find data on the last time the customer logged into the system and how frequently they're using it. And then what about the tone and tenor of their support tickets? That's going to be in a different system probably. And what about understanding whether the volume of their support cases today is higher or lower than it used to be in the past? And that's really difficult for, an account management leader on their own to try and go and wrap their arms around, what are all the indicators that we could be considering to inform this broader understanding of customer health, which is where, again, I think, forging that partnership with RevOps to really understand what's available, because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. It's like, oh, there's a whole landmine of data over there that I didn't even know about. And now that can become part of the picture. And so, kind of back to this notion of like, how do I know what to pay attention to? If I have a more robust sense of customer health and I see they're up for renewal in 6 months, but all of these other indicators really reinforce my understanding that they're in a good place, that's so important versus this one, the account manager is saying everything's good, but all these other things are suggesting that it's not. Well, that's going to kind of pivot my attention to say I need to dig in more there.
It's a good call. I was thinking something I've been saying a lot recently. My team's probably tired of me saying it, but are we working on the right things? Not are we working hard? Not are we working, but are we working on the right things? And I think that's exactly it. And it's really important, especially when you're juggling a million different things, priorities from the company, accounts, etc. So it's a great call out. When you look back over your career, I always am interested by challenges. What's a challenge that you've had to solve that you find yourself really proud of and the team accomplished, partly due to the complexity of the problem, but also due to the success of the solution?
Yeah, I am smiling because I think anybody that has ever worked in a revenue generating org understands that there is sometimes a lot of pressure around achieving revenue targets. And um, what really comes to mind for me was an occasion where that was the case. We were not, seeing that our revenue was on target with our goal and really needed to get creative and see, how can we look for solutions here. And one thing that I'm really proud of in how we approached that challenge was just the simple notion of cross-functional collaboration. It's something that I've shared with account management teams over and over again. Is it's one thing to build really strong relationships with your customers, but if you haven't also built really strong relationships within your organization with the people that you will depend on to help take care of that customer, because again, being kind of the quarterback for that customer within the organization, it could span needing help from accounting, from your legal department, from your marketing department, from RevOps, all across the board and up to the executive team. And so being able to rely on your internal colleagues when times are challenging requires intention, but it is something that I feel really proud of having been a part of a team where it felt like we're all in this together. This isn't like mine to solve by myself. And one of those cross-functional collaborative sessions was really truly just brainstorming, like, what could we do here to try to move the needle on this revenue here. And it truly was a like, we're throwing things at the wall. What if for this segment of the customer base, we look at doing a modest price increase? We're going to work with RevOps to do, it was truly impressive analysis on not only, what might that increase be, but then the modeling and the what if analysis on the churn side, right? Because that's a risk. Anytime you increase prices for somebody, they might decide it's not worth it to me at that price and they might walk out the door. And so, what would that tipping point be if X number of customers churn as a result relative to the benefits of this increased revenue? When do we say, kind of back to like needing to pivot sometimes, right? Like, when do we say, okay, the juice ain't worth the squeeze here, we're going to try something different? And, you know, having the support of the RevOps team to do that analysis, the support of the marketing team to help figure out the messaging, getting the buy-in from the account management team, who, let's be real, nobody's super excited to go deliver a message about a price increase. And so how are you going to get them on board with it? And I think that's where that trust came into play, to say, you know what, this was not a blind decision. A lot of analysis was done. We've got a contingency plan. If it starts to look like, it's not working, we're not going to keep going down that path. And then lo and behold, I think all of us were really pleasantly surprised that that kind of break even point of like, ooh, if we hit this level of churn, then we got to pull the plug. We didn't even come anywhere close to that. And it made such a significant difference on overall revenue attainment, and allowed so many of the team members who were maybe initially a little gun shy about it to then come around and say, oh my gosh, I had so much success as a result of that.
So I'm thinking about some of the things we talked about earlier, which is around trust, and you talked about that a lot of like, you know, getting to a point with your teammate, your team in particular, where they might. I mean, I remember that instance, and I remember at the beginning it was not received with open arms. It ended up being
No.
a very good thing for them, but it was not. It was there's obviously a lot of consternation, but I think kind of going back to your point earlier, there are two things that you said. One was just when you do get into moments where maybe it's not an easy decision or people don't love it, they trust you, knowing that Carrie didn't just flippantly make this decision, and so they're willing to kind of walk through that and lean into maybe something that's not comfortable, and try it out. And I think ultimately that obviously is really big. And the other thing you talked a lot about earlier too was the ability to take risk and be wrong. And I think that's something
Yeah.
else in this example you talked about was, I remember this project, like we used data as much as we could, but at the end of the day, again, there's a degree to where you get to the point where you're like, okay, we think this is a reasonable model, but it's still a model. And so, what
Yeah.
is kind of the parachute? What can we do, to evaluate, actually measure? I think that's one of the things a lot of times happens is like you do something and you forget to measure. And so, that was one of the things we did as well. But it was also the willingness to take that risk and say, hey, we're going to try this. To your point, we're throwing stuff up against the wall. We think this could work, and we're going to see it. And it was one of the times it did pan out. It doesn't always pan out. But I
Right.
think, yeah, as you talked about earlier, those are just two things that obviously reinforce a lot of this project in particular.
Yeah. I think nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? Like, you have to be willing to take chances. I think just in life, but certainly in business, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten, right? So you've got to be willing to try new things. But if you're doing that with some real evidence to back up your hypothesis, and then, like you said, it's such a great point, monitoring it as you go. And I think people miss that so often, right? It's like, I've decided that this is a good decision, the data supports it, and off we go. And then, wait a minute, did we ever go back and see if what we thought was going to happen is actually what happened? And so, yeah, I think that all kind of ties back into then potentially needing to say you were wrong, right? And kind of building trust in that way. But as you said, in this case, it actually ended up working out quite well. And so, yeah, I am proud of that, just because it was such a challenging situation, and it really just highlighted the value of teamwork and the value of using data, with obvious tremendous support from revenue operations. So yeah,
I'm still waiting on my lunch to be bought by one of those account managers. So I'll let you know if that.
I know.
There's a lot of a quota attainment there. So
Yes.
that's awesome. Those are always fun, right? It's like to your point. I remember that was a lot of people involved, and a lot of discussion of, hey, we feel like we've done the best analysis we can. At some point, you have to make a decision, and let's jump into it, but measure and monitor and see where we end up. And so, no, it's a great example. Last thing here, talk to me a little bit. Like, you've talked a lot about a couple of core components, but what is something that you just absolutely are really passionate about when it comes to running an account management, or just in general being a leader?
Yeah. I firmly believe that your team are the shoulders that you stand on, right? And um, being as selective as you can in building the best possible team, I think that is so much of the battle, when you can really truly rely on the team that you have, and there's a real sense of mutual trust and respect. I think really tremendous things can come from that. And I really strive to do what I say I will do. And like I said before, own it. If I got something wrong, it will happen. We, are often working in very fast paced environments with so many different competing priorities, and it's just going to happen that you're going to drop a ball here or there. But like we said, own what you can own, so that you are kind of just reinforcing that trustworthiness. I think goes such a long way, and people will pay it back to you, I find. I mean, you kind of mentioned it earlier. I think the time that we worked together, and it was, definitely some challenging times, but then looking around and seeing that I had this team and we were still together, we were in it together. And, I think that is a direct result of just kind of building that environment where it is okay to make mistakes. We can talk about it, we can learn from it, but we trust each other, that we're all showing up and doing the very best work that we can, and hopefully having, like we said, a little bit of fun. And that goes back to just building like the right team. If you've got good people on your team, then you're going to have a good time, sometimes doing some difficult things. And so I just really try to kind of lead with that authenticity.
It's an interesting thing, because building the right team is so hard. It's so
Yeah.
hard, and statistically speaking, you hire enough, like, you're still gonna get it wrong. I mean, I've been hiring
Yeah.
a long time now in my career, and I still don't get it right 100% of the time. But I will say, when you do get that right, I think about just a couple of different teams I've had in the past. Like, it's just and to your point, not just your actual team, but if you can get to where you've got a cross functional team you're working with, where you're all rowing. I think about, there's an analogy I've been thinking a lot about recently. I don't know if you've seen the movie Boys in the Boat, but it's
Yeah.
all about, right. It's like, it's actually set in your neck of the woods. So,
Yeah.
but that idea of just like in crew, right? If you can all row in the same direction at the same pace, get people in the right seats, which is a big part of that,
Yeah.
it makes a huge difference. So that's a great call out.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining today. This has been fun. It's always good to catch up, and thank you all for listening in on RevOps podcast. If you're not following Carrie, you can find her on LinkedIn. Please like, subscribe, follow. But Carrie, thanks again for joining today. It's great having you.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It was really fun.
Hit like, subscribe to continue to follow along as we get to impact change across our organizations in the industry. To the journey.